The moment my son locked the door behind me, I knew something inside him had changed forever. But what he didn't know was that something inside me had broken long before that. It was Mother's Day, a day I used to look forward to, even after Arthur, my husband of 40 years, passed away. My son David invited me to move in with him and his wife right after the funeral. "You shouldn't be alone," he said, voice heavy with sincerity. I believed him. I trusted that my only child, my baby boy, would take care of me the way I had once cared for him. But that trust, like delicate glass, had begun to crack. I just hadn't realized it had already shattered. That Sunday morning, the table was set with a half-hearted breakfast, dry pancakes, cold bacon, and a card that read, "To the world's best mom," in store-bought cursive. David's wife, Monica, barely looked up from her phone. I smiled anyway. I had learned to expect little and be grateful for crumbs. After breakfast, I asked David if he could drive me to the park. "Just for an hour," I said. "The roses are blooming." He looked at me like I'd asked for the moon. "You don't need to be going out anymore, Mom," he said. "You've got everything you need right here." I laughed, thinking he was joking. But then he stood, walked to the front door, and locked it. "You're not leaving this house anymore," he said, not cruelly, just decisively, as if it were a fact of nature. At that moment, something inside me recoiled like a frightened animal. I had felt confined before by age, by grief, but never imprisoned. "You don't mean that," I said quietly, looking at him through a veil of disbelief. "I do," he replied. "It's for your own good." He left the room, and I stood frozen in place, a coffee mug still warm in my hands. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed louder than it should have in such a quiet home. That night, I lay awake in the small guest room they called mine. The floral wallpaper I used to admire now looked like overgrown vines, crawling closer every time I blinked. I thought about the life I used to have teaching elementary school, volunteering at the library, tending my rose garden. I thought about Arthur and how we used to dance in the kitchen to Ella Fitzgerald records on Sunday mornings. I thought about all the things I'd given up, and I realized this wasn't just about David being overprotective. This was about control. For weeks, I obeyed. I didn't ask to go out again. I stayed quiet while Monica whispered on the phone with her friends about how annoying it was to have an old lady always around. I swallowed my pride when David installed a camera in the living room, just in case. I even tolerated the medications he brought me that made me drowsy and dulled my thoughts. But I wasn't asleep. I was watching, waiting. Then one afternoon, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to. I had dropped my needle under the couch and bent slowly to retrieve it when I heard Monica say, "If she goes into a home, the house becomes ours, right? That's how the trust works." My heart stopped. I stayed hidden, my knees aching, breath shallow. David answered, "Yeah, but if she's declared unfit, it'll be even faster. We just need her to, act unstable. I've been giving her the pills like the doctor said." I didn't cry. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, alone with the weight of what I'd heard, while the memory of their wedding day when I cried tears of joy watching him say his vows burned like acid in my throat. That night, I flushed the pills, and I made a plan. 2 weeks later, on a bright Wednesday morning, I stood by the living room window with a suitcase I had packed in secret over many quiet nights. It was small, just one bag, but it was filled with everything that still made me feel like a person: a photo of Arthur, my grandmother's rosary, and a bundle of handwritten letters tied with string. David had left for work. Monica was upstairs on a Zoom call. I waited for the mailman, Mr. Harris, a sweet old veteran who delivered mail to our cul-de-sac like clockwork at 10:14 a.m. every day. When he appeared, I slid the window open a crack and called out, "Mr. Harris, can you help me, please?" His eyes widened. "Mrs. Caldwell? You all right? I need you to call my lawyer. There's a number inside this envelope. Tell her I'm not safe." He didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am." Within an hour, there was a knock at the door. Not David. Not Monica. The police. They escorted me out of that house with dignity, wrapped in a warm gray cardigan and carrying my little suitcase. Monica shouted something I couldn't make out. David wasn't there to stop them. I went straight to my lawyer's office, where I signed a document that changed everything. I transferred ownership of my assets to a trust run by someone I had loved since she was a child, my goddaughter, Elise. A sharp, honest attorney who had always treated me like her second mother. Elise looked at me and said, "I'll take it from here, Aunt Ruth." And she did. That was 6 months ago. Now I live in a cozy assisted living apartment near the edge of town, overlooking the river where Arthur once proposed to me. I walk every morning. I join the book club. I paint. I dance with my neighbors to jazz records in the dining hall. I laugh again. David called last week. "Mom," he said, voice trembling. "Monica left me. She took everything. I made a mistake. Please can I come stay with you?" I paused, the silence thick with history. "No," I said gently, "but I'll pray for you." And I hung up. I didn't cry after I hung up on David. Not because it didn't hurt, of course it did, but because some part of me had already mourned the boy I raised. The boy who used to kiss my cheek before school and bring me wildflowers from the edge of the yard. That boy was gone long before he picked up the phone to ask for help. What remained was a man shaped by greed and fear and maybe, deep down, guilt he didn't know how to live with. But guilt is not redemption. And I had finally learned that I wasn't put on this earth to keep saving people who wouldn't save me in return. The next day, I went downstairs for breakfast and sat beside Marjorie, a feisty retired librarian with bright red hair and a louder laugh. "You look like you've let go of a burden," she said between bites of her buttered toast. "I did," I replied. "And he wasn't even heavy, just hollow." She cackled so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. In the months that followed my escape from David's house, I started writing again. Not professionally, just little essays and poems in a notebook I kept by my bed. It helped me stitch my memories together, thread by thread, like a quilt I'd long abandoned and suddenly remembered how to finish. Every Friday afternoon, a group of us gathered in the common room. There were 9 of us, all over 70. We called ourselves the Unburdened. It started as a joke after Henry, a wiry old man who once owned a jazz club in Detroit, said, "We've all outlived our usefulness, so let's at least out-talk our ghosts." That first meeting, we just told stories. But by the third week, something changed. People started bringing photos, old letters, small heirlooms. And with each story came revelations about what we'd endured, what we'd survived, and what we'd lost. One afternoon, I shared the moment I realized my son no longer saw me as a person, just a burden. There were tears in the room. Not just mine. Florence, who had 3 sons and hadn't seen any of them in years, reached for my hand. "I know that pain," she whispered. "And I know the freedom that comes after it." The freedom. That's what surprised me the most. Not the hurt. Not the betrayal. But the freedom I felt once I accepted that love could be real and still end. That motherhood wasn't a chain, and age wasn't a cage. I started painting again too. At first, it was just flowers and skies. But eventually, the images darkened stormy windows, locked doors, a single figure standing in a hallway filled with shadows. It wasn't until Elise visited and saw one of the paintings that I realized what I was doing. "You're telling your story," she said, her voice tight with emotion. I nodded. "And I'm telling it in full color this time." Elise had been a constant since the day she helped me reclaim my life. She came every other Sunday, always bringing fresh fruit and some legal gossip. But one afternoon, she brought something else. David. He didn't come inside. He stood outside the window of the community art room, hands buried in his jacket pockets, looking older than he should. "He's asked to see you," Elise said softly. "Just once." I turned to the glass and stared at the man I barely recognized. His shoulders hunched forward like he was bracing for a blow. His eyes, once so filled with stubborn fire, now looked dimmed, sunken by something deeper than sorrow. "What do you think I should do?" I asked her, genuinely unsure. "I think forgiveness is a gift," she said. "But it's not owed. And it's not always wise." I looked at David again and remembered him at 5 years old, chasing fireflies in the backyard. At 16, sitting beside me after Arthur's funeral, holding my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. And I thought, I can forgive the boy, but I don't owe the man anything. So I walked to the window, opened it just a few inches, and said, "I hope you find peace." Then I closed it again. That night, I had a dream. I was in my old house, the one Arthur and I built brick by brick. It was filled with light. Roses bloomed in every room. I walked from room to room, barefoot, feeling warmth seep through the wooden floors. And then I saw him, Arthur, standing in the kitchen, holding a record sleeve. "Dance with me?" he asked. I stepped into his arms, and we swayed to a song I couldn't hear, but somehow still remembered. When I woke up, I felt the weight of years roll off my chest. I was free. 1 week later, Elise invited me to speak at a local law conference about elder rights and guardianship abuse. I hesitated at first. I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't anyone important, not anymore. But Elise looked at me and said, "You survived. That's enough." So I said yes. I stood on that stage, a small one in a modest hotel ballroom, and told my story. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I just told the truth. The moment I said, "My son locked me in his house and called it love," I heard a gasp from the crowd. But I didn't flinch. I stood tall. Afterward, a dozen people came up to me. A woman in her 40s with tears in her eyes told me her mother had died in a nursing home she hadn't wanted to be in. A man whose sister was fighting to control his father's estate asked if he could put me in touch with his dad. My story became a torch for others to see by. And I realized something else. Maybe I wasn't done being useful after all. The day after the conference, I woke up to find a handwritten letter on my breakfast tray. It had no return address. Only my name, Ruth Caldwell, and familiar, slanted handwriting I hadn't seen since David was in high school. Inside were 2 pages. No signature. But I didn't need one. "Mom, I listened to your speech. Someone sent me the video. I watched the whole thing twice. I don't know what to say except that I see it now. I see all of it. What I did. What I took. What I destroyed. And what I lost. You deserved better than the kind of love that comes with locks and pills. I thought I was protecting you. But the truth is I was protecting myself from the guilt of not visiting, from the fear of losing you, from the fact that I never really dealt with Dad's death. You were grieving, and I made your grief about me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know I'm trying. I joined a support group. I moved out of the house. Monica's gone, and honestly, maybe that's for the best. I think I let her reshape the way I saw the world, and it turned me into someone I don't like looking at in the mirror. I don't know who I am without your approval. I guess I never really grew up. I hope you're happy now. I hope you're free. And if someday you feel ready to talk, not to make things right, but just to say goodbye, I'll be here." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of my nightstand, beside my wedding ring and Arthur's old pocket watch. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph. Just a kind of stillness, the kind that comes after a storm, when the wind has settled and the broken branches lay quiet on the ground. That afternoon, I painted again. This time it wasn't a locked door or a shadowy hallway. It was a window, wide open, sunlight pouring through, and outside a single rosebush in bloom. Around the same time, something strange started happening. The staff at the assisted living center began receiving letters not just from families of residents, but from strangers in town. People had heard my story. Some had read newspaper articles. Others had seen clips online. They wrote things like, "I've been scared to speak up about what my daughter's doing with my bank account. Thank you for giving me courage. You reminded me that I'm still a person. I'd forgotten. I called my mom today for the first time in 2 years. I said I was sorry." Every letter felt like a thread pulling me back into the world, not the one where I was a prisoner in my son's house, but the one where I was a voice, a presence, maybe even a force. Elise smiled when I showed her the stack. "You've started a ripple," she said. "Now you just have to keep it going." So we did. With Elise's help, I started a small nonprofit called Second Bloom. We offered free legal consults for seniors experiencing emotional, financial, or physical abuse from within their families. We held workshops on how to recognize coercion, how to protect your assets, and most importantly, how to reclaim your voice. Our motto was simple: you are not a burden. You are a life still in bloom. At first, it was just us, a few residents from the center, a retired social worker, and Elise managing paperwork on her weekends. But then people started calling, donating, volunteering. We hosted a community event in the park I used to beg David to take me to. I wore a rose brooch and stood on the stage as a choir of seniors sang, "This Little Light of Mine," under the sycamore trees. It was the same park where Arthur once surprised me with a picnic after a long day of parent-teacher conferences. I looked up at the sky, whispered his name, and smiled. You'd be proud of me, I thought. Then, in early spring, I got a call from David. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. This time, he left a message. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to say I'm proud of what you're doing. I saw the website. I read the article in the Tribune. I think maybe helping people is what you were meant to do all along. And I think I needed to lose you to see you clearly. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. Even the things I didn't understand at the time. I hope you're okay." I hope you're better than okay. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time. Then I pressed delete. By midsummer, Second Bloom had helped over 50 seniors in our county. The local news called us a quiet revolution led by the people we too often ignore. I laughed when I read that. I wasn't trying to start a revolution. I was just trying to survive, and somewhere along the way, I'd started growing again. Florence from The Unburdened began teaching memoir writing classes. Henry hosted a jazz hour every Tuesday. Marjorie even fell in love with a man she met during one of our seminars, a retired mailman named Carl. He delivers more than mail, she whispered to me one day, winking. We were building something. Not just a movement, a community. One where age wasn't a sentence, but a season. One evening, just before sunset, Elise and I sat outside the center on a wooden bench overlooking the garden. The roses were blooming again, deep crimson and blushing pink. I have a proposal, she said, handing me a folder. Inside was a grant application, state funding for a larger initiative, an office downtown, 3 new staff members. You'd be our founder, our figurehead. I looked at the folder, then back at the garden. Elise, I said softly, what if I don't have much time left? She smiled gently. Then we build it while you do. You plant the seeds. We'll water them. And in that moment, I felt something rise in me, not ambition, not pride, but purpose. The kind I thought I'd buried with Arthur. The kind that had once guided me through raising a child, loving a man, teaching in classrooms filled with chaos and joy. Purpose, in its purest form. To help, to witness, to matter. The day after I agreed to submit the grant proposal with Elise, I sat down with a fresh notebook. Not to sketch or to journal this time. I wanted to start writing my full story. Not just the trauma. Not just the betrayal. The whole life. The way Arthur would always burn the toast, but insist it added texture. The way David used to sneak into our room during thunderstorms, crawling under the quilt without saying a word. The way I once stood in front of a classroom full of second graders, heart pounding, realizing I had finally found where I belonged. I started writing those memories down in the order they came, unfiltered, unorganized, but honest. And as I wrote, I noticed something I hadn't expected. The pain softened when I didn't try to hide it. When I let it sit beside the joy and the laughter and the quiet moments that had once made my life so full. That same week, Florence asked if I'd consider reading some of my writing at our next Unburdened gathering. You're the reason we started this group, she said, handing me a cup of peppermint tea. You gave us permission to speak. I think it's time we heard your story too. I agreed. The following Thursday, I sat in the middle of our circle, notebook in hand, and read aloud. When my son told me I wasn't leaving the house anymore, I felt something I couldn't name then. It wasn't just fear. It was erasure. As if my name Ruth had been replaced by a label. Old, forgetful, inconvenient, fragile. But I was still there. I was still me. I just needed someone to see it. In the end, I saw it for myself. No one clapped when I finished. They didn't need to. Marjorie wiped a tear. Henry nodded solemnly. Florence placed her hand over mine. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Weeks passed, and the grant application went through. We got the funding. Our new office, a modest 2-room space above a community clinic, opened in early fall. Elise had a plaque made for the front door. Second Bloom, founded by Ruth Caldwell. Because every life deserves to bloom again. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was simple. No press, no speeches, just our little circle, now expanded into a growing network of seniors, advocates, lawyers, and even a few college interns. One of the interns, Mia, brought me a framed photo of a rose in full bloom, taken by her grandfather, one of our first clients. He had been living with a verbally abusive daughter-in-law for years, too ashamed to tell anyone. You gave him his life back, Mia said. No, I replied, smiling. He just remembered it was his to take back. I began giving small talks at community centers and retirement homes. Not lectures, conversations. I didn't talk at people. I talked with them. I asked questions. I listened. And I started to notice a pattern in the stories they shared. It wasn't just about abuse or neglect. It was about being dismissed, overlooked, treated like burdens or shadows, stripped of their voice. One woman, Lorraine, told me she'd been signing her checks over to her son for years because he gets angry when I ask about money. A retired firefighter named Sal whispered that his daughter had sold his medals online and told him he was too senile to notice. An 82-year-old man named Charles simply said, "They stopped asking me what I wanted. They just started deciding." Each story added a stitch to the fabric of what Second Bloom was becoming, not just a place for legal help, but a sanctuary for dignity. One evening, long after the office had closed, I found myself sitting alone in the front room. A storm had rolled in summer's last gasp before autumn settled in. The rain pattered on the windows. The lights flickered. And in the quiet, I thought again of David. Not the man who locked me in, but the boy who used to run through the house with a wooden sword, pretending to be King Arthur. The boy who once cried for an hour when I threw away his macaroni art by mistake. I didn't regret refusing to let him move in with me, but I also didn't hate him anymore. That realization came quietly, like the first breath after a long cry. I reached for my notebook again and wrote. Maybe love doesn't die. Maybe it just changes. Maybe, sometimes, it needs to go underground for a while like bulbs in winter before it can bloom again. The next week, David showed up, unannounced, standing outside the Second Bloom office with a paper bag in his hands, rainwater soaking his shoulders. Elise called me immediately. "You don't have to come," she said. "We'll handle it." But I went. He stood when I entered. "Hi, Mom." I nodded. "David." He looked older, not just in the face, but in the posture, the weight he carried. The paper bag he held was damp at the bottom. "I just wanted to return these," he said, extending it toward me. "They belong to Dad." Inside were Arthur's gardening gloves, his pocket knife, and the Ella Fitzgerald vinyl he used to play on Sundays. I took the bag. "Thank you," I said, voice steady. "I'm in therapy now," he added. "Group and individual. And I'm volunteering at the shelter. Just trying." I studied his face, not for lies, but for truth. And I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Humility. "I'm glad," I said. "I really am." He took a deep breath. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." "I'm not ready to give it," I replied. "But I don't need you to carry my anger anymore. It's mine, and I'm setting it down." He nodded slowly. "Fair." There was silence. Then, softly, he said, "Mom, are you happy now?" I looked at the sign behind me, Second Bloom. I thought of Arthur's laugh, the rose painting, the circle of friends waiting for me at home. I thought of the quiet voice inside me that had once been too afraid to speak, but now rang clear as a bell. "Yes," I said. After David left that afternoon, I sat alone in the office for a while. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt still, peaceful, as if something that had once been broken had finally settled into place, not repaired, but accepted, like a crooked branch on a healthy tree. That night, I walked through the garden path behind the center. The roses had begun to wilt, not dead, just leaning gently, petals loose. Autumn was coming. Everything was preparing to rest. I stopped at the bench Arthur had helped donate before he passed the one with the little plaque that read, "In full bloom, always AC." I sat, closed my eyes, and let the cool wind comb gently through my hair. The following week, Florence brought a new idea to our group. A life book project, a way for each of us to write, record, or draw our personal histories to leave behind, not just for family, but for ourselves. "It's not about legacy," she said. "It's about identity. We are who we remember ourselves to be." I love the idea. One woman named Hattie had never told anyone she'd been in love with another woman in the 1950s. She wrote it down, a beautiful piece called Dorothy's Laugh, and when she read it aloud, no one blinked. No one judged. We just listened, and clapped, and cried. This was the world I wanted to live in. The one where no story was too small, too messy, or too late to matter. In December, we held a celebration at the center, not just for the holidays, but for everything we'd built. There were lights strung through the trees, spiced cider, and music. Henry played piano with arthritic fingers, still hitting every note like his soul was younger than all of us put together. Marjorie danced with Carl beneath a canopy of paper snowflakes made by the daycare kids down the street. Florence wore a velvet shawl and read a poem she'd written titled Things I No Longer Regret. And me? I stood at the front with Elise and held a candle as we lit the lantern that marked our founding day. I thought I had lost everything, I said into the mic. But it turns out, I was just being planted. They clapped. Not wildly, not politely, but warmly, deeply. And I knew, in that moment, I had come back to life. Not long after the new year, Elise pulled me aside during one of our office meetings. "There's something we need to talk about," she said, her voice gentle but serious. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was my latest medical report. I had gone for routine blood work and a scan a few weeks earlier, thinking little of it. The results weren't catastrophic, but they weren't trivial either. Your kidneys are showing signs of decline, she said. You're stable, but you'll need monitoring. Maybe more. We'll take it one step at a time. I closed the folder quietly. I wasn't scared, not exactly. I'd lived a long, rich life. I wasn't afraid of the end, but I was afraid of being diminished again, of losing control. I don't want to become someone's problem, I whispered. You won't, Elise said, her eyes glistening. Because now, you know better. You'll choose, and we'll respect your choices. I nodded. I trusted her, more than I trusted anyone else in the world. The diagnosis didn't stop me. If anything, it sharpened me. I wrote more. I painted daily. I began mentoring younger women caregivers, social workers, students who wanted to work with elders but didn't know where to begin. One of them, a sweet girl named Rachel, asked me during our first meeting, "How do you keep your hope after everything?" I told her the truth. I stopped expecting people to give me hope. I started growing it myself. She wrote that down. By spring, Second Bloom had expanded into 2 neighboring counties. Elise was working full-time, and we had 3 new staff members. We'd helped over 200 seniors directly and trained hundreds of professionals on how to spot emotional coercion. I didn't do the heavy lifting anymore. I didn't need to. I had already planted enough seeds. Now I just watered them, smiled as they grew. And sometimes, when no one was looking, I would sit in the back of the community events and just listen. To laughter, to storytelling, to people being seen again. That was more healing than anything medicine could offer. One afternoon, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo of David as a child, holding my hand at the zoo. Taped to the back was a note. "Thank you for teaching me how to love, even when I didn't know how to return it. I'm still trying." There was no name, but I knew. I placed the photo in the last page of my life book. Not because I had forgiven him fully, but because that part of my story mattered, too. Not all endings need to be tidy. Some just need to be true. Summer came again. The roses bloomed brighter than ever, maybe because the soil had finally been turned, fed by all the grief and grit I'd carried for so long. On my 81st birthday, the entire center threw a surprise party for me. I wore a white dress. Elise brought a cake shaped like a book. Henry played Ella Fitzgerald's At Last, and everyone clapped as I danced slowly, alone, eyes closed. I didn't miss the people who weren't there. I honored the ones who were. And I danced not because I felt young again, but because I no longer needed to. "You're not leaving this house anymore," my son once said. But he was wrong. Because I left. I left the house. I left the silence. I left the shame. I left the cage that looked like care, but felt like concrete. And now? Now I live. I speak. I bloom. I belong. And no one, not even my past, can lock that door again.